Welcome to the Stories for Sleep channel. Don't forget to subscribe and like right away, because by the end of the lecture, you'll be fast asleep. Close your eyes, the story is about to begin. In the heart of Mesopotamia, on the fertile banks of the Tigris and Euphrates, rose a city that even in antiquity was called a symbol of greatness and depravity. For some, it was a place of countless riches and luxury; for others, the embodiment of human pride and fall. Its walls were considered impregnable. Its towers strived towards the sky, and the famous hanging gardens were counted among the 7 wonders of the world, glorifying Babylon for centuries. It was a city where reality merged with legend, and history became myth. Today, we remember it not as one of many vanished ancient centers, but as a symbol of an entire civilization. Babylon entered myths and religious texts, leaving a mark on biblical stories and in the cultural memory of humanity. Its image combined wealth and sin, luxury and destruction, dream and punishment. Today, we will journey through the history of Babylon and learn how a small city on the banks of 2 rivers turned into the symbol of an entire civilization. Around 4,000 years ago, the fertile valley of Mesopotamia, lying between the 2 great rivers Tigris and Euphrates, became a cradle of civilization, one of the first on the planet. Here, amidst swamps, reed thickets, and meadows, people learned to cultivate the land, build the simplest canal systems for irrigation, and establish the first settlements. The earliest inhabitants of this region were the Sumerians, a mysterious people whose origin still raises many questions. They were the first in human history to build large cities such as Uruk, Lagash, and Kish. Each of these cities was a separate state with its own territory, rulers, armies, and temples dedicated to the gods who protected and patronized their inhabitants. The Sumerians created the world's first writing system, cuneiform, which appeared around 3200 BC, roughly at the same time as the emergence of Egyptian writing. They learned to create complex astronomical calendars and devised the first written laws. Parallel to the Sumerians, in the northern and central regions of Mesopotamia, the Akkadians appeared, Semitic tribes who spoke the Akkadian language, related to the future languages of the ancient Hebrews and Arabs. The Akkadians gradually began to adopt the culture and achievements of the Sumerians, absorbing the best and adapting it to their own traditions. Gradually, these 2 great cultures merged into one, forming a common Mesopotamian civilization, on the basis of which Babylon would later arise. The rise of a city-state. Babylon likely existed as a small settlement long before the 20th century BCE. However, around 2000 BC, it began to stand out among neighboring city-states and became an independent political entity. At first, it was a modest, unremarkable town surrounded by fields and swamps. There were many similar settlements around, each striving to survive in the harsh conditions of endless wars and raids by neighbors. Initially, the inhabitants of Babylon led a simple life, engaged mainly in agriculture, crafts, and trade with other cities in the valley. They revered the same gods as the Sumerians but called them by their own names. The temple was the central place in the city's life, where regular rituals and sacrifices were held to ensure the favor of the gods and a good harvest. The people of Babylon spoke their own dialect of the Akkadian language and used Sumerian cuneiform, although by that time the Sumerian language was gradually falling out of colloquial use. It remained only as a sacred language for religious ceremonies, much like Latin in medieval Europe. For everyday writing, the Babylonians used the Akkadian version of cuneiform. Documents that have survived to this day show what the daily life of the first Babylonians was like. These were economic reports, merchants' letters, marriage contracts, and sales agreements, reflecting the active economic and social life of the citizens. In its early stages, Babylon was constantly overshadowed by more powerful city-states that possessed greater political and military strength. Babylon was forced to maneuver between its powerful neighbors, maintaining neutrality and caution. However, thanks to its favorable geographical position at the intersection of important trade routes connecting the north and south of Mesopotamia, the city gradually grew rich and gained influence. Merchants traveling through Mesopotamia began to stop there more frequently, gradually turning Babylon into an important regional trade center. The era of Hammurabi. Babylon grew and strengthened, but a truly bright chapter in its history began in the 18th century BC when a man came to power who would forever change the fate of the city and all of southern Mesopotamia. His name was Hammurabi, and the first great flourishing of Babylon is associated with his name. When Hammurabi inherited the throne around 1792 BC, Babylon was already a notable city among the states of Mesopotamia, though not the center of the entire region. It remained just one of many states constantly involved in internal conflicts and struggles for control over fertile lands and trade routes. Hammurabi was not only a wise and cunning ruler but also a talented military commander. He quickly realized that to prosper and strengthen his power, he needed to unite all the small city-states of southern Mesopotamia under his rule and put an end to the endless strife. Over several decades, Hammurabi waged successful wars and diplomatic negotiations with his neighbors. Step by step, he conquered rival cities and regions, either through skillful diplomatic maneuvers or by force of arms. As a result, by the middle of his reign, Hammurabi had managed to unite a significant part of Mesopotamia and create, for the first time, a single and powerful state with Babylon as its center. Thus, he transformed the city from a regional center into a true capital of a large empire. Under Hammurabi, Babylon began to grow rapidly, acquiring powerful walls, majestic palaces and temples, and numerous markets and squares where trade and public life thrived. The most talented and educated people of his time, scholars, priests, scribes, merchants, and architects, gathered at the ruler's court. But Hammurabi understood that governing a large state was impossible without clear and universally understood laws. He wanted his empire to be not just strong, but also just. Therefore, he commissioned the compilation and recording of one of the first surviving law codes, known today as the Code of Hammurabi. This code was carved on a huge stone stele and placed in the center of Babylon so that everyone could see and know the rules by which society was now to be structured. The Code of Hammurabi consisted of 282 articles and covered almost all aspects of life, from trade and family relations to crimes and punishments. It detailed people's responsibilities to the state and each other, and clearly specified penalties for misconduct and crimes. Among its famous provisions was the principle of talion, or the law of retaliation, formulated as, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Although this may seem cruel today, for that time it was an attempt to make punishment just and proportional to the crime committed. The laws protected property rights, regulated marriage and inheritance, defined the rules of trade and usury, and strictly established the responsibility of builders. For example, if a constructed house collapsed and killed the owner, the architect was to be executed. Moreover, if the owner's son died in the collapse, it was the builder's son who was punished. This may seem incredibly harsh, but it was how the highest sense of responsibility and meticulousness was fostered in society. At the same time, Hammurabi's laws reflected the harsh reality of the period, establishing inequality based on social strata. They clearly distinguished between free citizens, freedmen, and slaves. For instance, knocking out the eye of a free man was punished by the eye for an eye principle. But for the same harm done to a slave, the guilty party only had to pay a monetary fine. Such a stark difference in punishment was common for that era and testified to the strict social hierarchy. The system of slavery was also thoroughly detailed in Hammurabi's laws. Slaves played an important role in the economy and daily life of Babylon. The main source of slaves was military campaigns. When the Babylonians defeated neighboring peoples or tribes, prisoners were often enslaved. In addition, there was debt slavery. A person unable to repay a debt on time fell into temporary dependence on the creditor. However, such slavery could not last forever. After 3 years, the debtor was freed. The children of slaves, and those who sold themselves or their relatives to survive hard times of famine or disaster, also became slaves. Occasionally, a free person could be enslaved for crimes or serious offenses, but these were exceptional cases. The system of slavery in Babylon was harsh but had clear legal frameworks and limitations set by Hammurabi himself. The laws also provided for extremely severe punishments. The death penalty could be applied for a wide range of crimes: theft, false accusation, sorcery, adultery, or a slave escaping from a master. Moreover, there was a principle of collective responsibility, according to which punishment for serious misconduct or mistakes by one person could extend to members of their family. Thus, the laws of Hammurabi were not only revolutionary in their clarity and precision but also reflected the very harsh realities of life in ancient Mesopotamia. It was thanks to Hammurabi and his code of laws that Babylon first became a model of an organized and stable state, which managed to unite the diverse and fragmented peoples of southern Mesopotamia under its rule. Another important event of Hammurabi's era was the beginning of the rise of the cult of the god Marduk. Before this period, Marduk was one of many Mesopotamian deities worshipped by local residents, but he did not hold a dominant position and had no special status throughout Mesopotamia. The roots of Marduk's cult were specifically linked to the Babylonian tradition, although it formed within the broader Mesopotamian religion, which borrowed heavily from the more ancient traditions of the Sumerians and Akkadians. Under Hammurabi, Marduk became the chief patron of Babylon and his entire empire. The king himself claimed that he received his power and the right to unify southern Mesopotamia by the will of Marduk, whom he called his personal patron and protector of Babylon. This decision had not only religious but also significant political meaning. The new cult helped unite disparate territories and tribes under his rule, giving them a common religious foundation and thereby strengthening the central authority of the ruler. The Babylonians usually depicted Marduk as a majestic and powerful warrior, armed with a battle bow or lightning bolts, symbolizing his power and strength. He was often depicted wearing a tall headdress with horns, emphasizing his divine nature and high position in the hierarchy. Also under Hammurabi, the priests of Marduk began to increase their influence. Although they did not yet wield enormous political power, it was under this king that they first received significant privileges and began to take an active part in state life. In the following centuries, especially during the kingdom's zenith, the priestly elite would become one of the key political forces, capable of influencing the fate of kings and the direction of the entire country's development. The era of Hammurabi marked the beginning of the gradual rise of the cult of Marduk, becoming an important step on its path to becoming the central figure in the religious and political life of Babylon. Decline and foreign rule. After Hammurabi's death, his empire faced severe trials. The state, once powerful and stable, quickly plunged into a period of deep turmoil and internal instability. The reason for this was that the great king's heirs were too weak and inexperienced, as well as the very nature of his empire. Hammurabi's empire was largely an artificial creation, held together mainly by the authority and personal charisma of the ruler himself. As soon as he died, many cities and regions united under his rule immediately rebelled and tried to regain their independence. Endless wars, rebellions, and internal conflicts began, which gradually weakened Babylon and exhausted its strength. Against this backdrop of decline, Babylon became particularly vulnerable to external threats, and soon it faced its most severe trial. Around 1595 BC, a powerful Hittite army led by King Mursilai I invaded from the territories of Asia Minor. This invasion was a complete surprise to the Babylonians, as it was carried out from a great distance and very quickly. Although the Hittites were known for their powerful war chariots, the key factors were the surprise of the attack and the rapid march of the Hittite army, which managed to cover a great distance and catch the city off guard. The Hittites sacked the city, seizing wealth that had been accumulated over many generations. They destroyed palaces, temples, and walls, leaving behind terrible devastation and chaos. Although the Hittites did not stay in Babylon for long and soon returned north, the damage was enormous. The looting and destruction were a shock to the inhabitants, which for a long time deprived Babylon of its former power and completely undermined its political authority in the region. Weakened and exhausted, the city soon fell into the hands of another people, the Kassites, warrior tribes who came from the mountainous regions east of Mesopotamia. Unlike the Hittites, the Kassites did not engage in swift raids and destruction. Their arrival in Babylon was gradual and much calmer. Modern historians often call this period a peaceful occupation because the Kassites did not seek to suppress local traditions or destroy the culture of the territories they conquered. On the contrary, the Kassite kings tried to integrate into Mesopotamian civilization, adopting the language, customs, religion, and even many elements of governance characteristic of Babylon. Under the Kassites, the city gradually recovered from its calamities. The rulers of this new dynasty often called themselves kings of Babylon, emphasizing their respect for the traditions and history of the state they had conquered. They actively restored temples and public buildings, patronized priests and scholars, and supported arts and crafts. This period is considered one of the most stable in its history after the turbulent and dramatic events that followed the era of Hammurabi. However, the stability of the Kassite era could not restore the city's former political power. Babylon lost the status of a dominant center it once held, becoming just one of the provinces in the large and complex world of Mesopotamia. Nevertheless, despite its political weakening, Babylon retained enormous cultural significance. It was during this period that Babylonian scholars and priests not only preserved the ancient knowledge of Sumerian and Akkadian texts but also multiplied it by copying and systematizing the documents that had come down to them. Babylon became a center of learning, a place where ancient libraries and archives were kept, and its cultural authority was still highly valued in the eyes of the inhabitants of Mesopotamia. The period of Kassite rule, which provided Babylon with relative stability and the opportunity for cultural recovery, could not last forever. The Kassite dynasty maintained its power until about 1155 BC, after which it gradually lost control over Babylon. A period of internal instability followed, and by the beginning of the first millennium BC, a new powerful force emerged on the political stage of Mesopotamia, Assyria. The Assyrians, who spoke an Akkadian language and inhabited the northern regions of Mesopotamia, actively sought to expand their territories and subdue the lands of southern Mesopotamia. Their state began to strengthen noticeably, and the powerful Assyrian army was famous for its organization, discipline, and cruelty. It rapidly seized new territories, and the rich, strategically important city of Babylon naturally attracted the close attention of the northern conquerors. The relationship between Babylon and Assyria during this time was extremely volatile and unstable. Depending on the political situation, they could be allies, temporary partners, or become irreconcilable enemies. Assyrian policy towards Babylon also changed dramatically, from patronage and respect for Babylonian religion to incredible cruelty and destruction. One of the most striking and tragic examples was the reign of the Assyrian king Sennacherib, who, after another rebellion in 689 BC, completely destroyed Babylon, subjecting the city to terrible devastation. However, despite these brutal destructions, Babylon invariably recovered, and the Assyrian rulers were forced to recognize its special role as the religious center of all of Mesopotamia. The cult of Marduk continued to play a key role in the religious life of the region. The annual New Year festival of Akita became such an important event that even Assyrian kings came to Babylon to publicly confirm their power and receive the symbolic approval of the gods. This underscored both the spiritual and political significance of the city in the eyes of all peoples of the two rivers. The local priesthood played an important role in maintaining Babylon's religious status and preserving the cultural identity of the population. The priests of Marduk enjoyed enormous authority among the inhabitants and often became the spiritual leaders of the resistance against Assyrian rule. Nevertheless, despite Assyria's attempts to gain the support of the local population through participation in Babylon's religious life, discontent grew in the city due to constant invasions, cruelty, heavy taxes, and the humiliating position of a subordinate province. The Babylonians repeatedly rose up in rebellion against Assyrian rule, trying to regain their lost freedom and greatness. The Neo-Babylonian Empire, a golden age. By the middle of the 7th century BC, the patience of Babylon's inhabitants was finally exhausted. In 626 BC, a man named Nabopolassar rose to lead the rebellion. He was an energetic and capable leader who managed to unite various strata of Babylonian society. He was not only a talented military commander but also a skilled politician. From the very beginning of the rebellion, Nabopolassar acted decisively and consistently. He skillfully organized local armed detachments, quickly secured the support of a significant portion of the population, and also sought help from other neighboring peoples who also suffered from Assyrian domination. The rebellion of the Babylonians was soon joined by the Chaldeans and the Medes, who played a particularly important role in the success of the entire enterprise. Nabopolassar brilliantly exploited the weakening of the Assyrian state, which was experiencing internal political conflicts and economic difficulties at the time. One of the most important features of Nabopolassar's rebellion was its reliance on ancient traditions and the cult of Marduk. The priests actively supported the uprising, convincing the inhabitants of divine support for their cause. Nabopolassar himself, entering the struggle, emphasized that he was acting with the will and blessing of Babylon's main patron, Marduk. He not only regained independence for his city but also laid the foundations for the creation of a powerful state that would soon become one of the most significant and prosperous in the history of the ancient Near East. Nebuchadnezzar II. After the victory over Assyria and the restoration of Babylon's independence, power in the city was firmly established in the hands of the new dynasty founded by Nabopolassar. However, the true golden age of Babylon was associated not with Nabopolassar himself, but with his son and heir, whose name has forever entered history, Nebuchadnezzar II. He was able to not only preserve and strengthen his father's achievements but also to turn the Babylonian state into one of the most powerful and extensive empires of the ancient world. Nebuchadnezzar ascended the throne in 605 BCE. His ambition was to restore to Babylon the glory and influence the city had possessed in the distant times of Hammurabi. A series of swift and successful military campaigns significantly expanded the state's borders. The main direction of Nebuchadnezzar's conquests was the Western territories. He successfully conquered Syria, Phoenicia, and Judah, subjugating important trade routes and strengthening his influence in the Mediterranean. Particularly significant were the military actions against the Kingdom of Judah and its capital, Jerusalem. The first siege of Jerusalem in 597 BC ended with the capture of the Judean king Jehoiakim and a significant portion of the nobility. Thanks to his victories, the Babylonian state inherited the role of the main power in the ancient Near East, a position previously held by the Assyrian Empire. However, a key feature of Nebuchadnezzar's conquests was not only their scale but also the effective system of managing the conquered peoples. If conquered peoples dutifully paid tribute and recognized the supremacy of Babylon, they were allowed to preserve their own culture, language, and even religion. This allowed him to maintain stability in the empire. Furthermore, the vast conquered territories became a source of wealth, enabling Babylon to experience an incredible economic and cultural boom. Immense riches in the form of precious metals, ivory, rare woods, spices, and other exotic goods flowed into the city from all corners of the vast empire. Thus, thanks to the determination, political wisdom, and military talents of Nebuchadnezzar, Babylon reached its highest power and became the true center of the ancient world. Religion, gods, and myths. During the reign of Nebuchadnezzar II, the religious life of Babylon reached its peak. The cult of the supreme god Marduk achieved its maximum flourishing, definitively securing his status as the supreme ruler of the world. The main cult center of Marduk was the Temple of Asagila. The most important religious ceremonies took place around it, especially the Akita festival, the main Mesopotamian New Year celebration. On this day, the statue of Marduk was solemnly carried out of the temple, and the king personally participated in a complex ritual to confirm his authority. Interestingly, the ceremony included the symbolic humiliation of the king. The high priest would slap him, and the king had to shed a tear, demonstrating the sincerity of his repentance and submission to the will of the gods. However, the religious life of Babylon included other important gods. A special place among the Mesopotamian deities was held by the goddess Ishtar. She was one of the most vibrant, powerful, and at the same time contradictory figures in all of Near Eastern mythology. Ishtar was revered simultaneously as the goddess of love and fertility, as well as of war, revenge, and destruction. Her image embodied the duality of nature and life itself. Ishtar was famous for her vibrant sexuality, expressed in numerous myths and rituals. One of the central rituals of her cult was the so-called sacred marriage. During this ceremony, the king would symbolically enter into an intimate relationship with the goddess's high priestess, who at that moment was considered the living embodiment of Ishtar herself. This ritual had a distinctly erotic character and symbolized the union of the goddess and her chosen one, thereby ensuring the fertility of the land, the prosperity of the state, and the strengthening of the king's power. In mythology, Ishtar often appeared as a passionate and jealous goddess whose feelings and desires became the cause of suffering and death for her chosen ones. A famous example is the myth of Gilgamesh, in which the goddess, consumed by an indomitable desire, tried to seduce the hero. However, Gilgamesh, well aware of the fate of Ishtar's previous lovers, rejected her proposal, fearing the sad consequences of her passions. Insulted by the refusal, Ishtar in a rage turned to the supreme god Anu and demanded that he send the bull of heaven against Gilgamesh and his city, a terrible monster that caused great destruction and many deaths. According to an ancient Babylonian legend, Ishtar once decided to descend into the underworld, which was ruled by her elder sister, the stern and merciless goddess Ereshkigal. Ishtar was driven by a desire for power, an aspiration to extend her influence even to the kingdom of the dead. But this journey, as the legend goes, was incredibly dangerous. There was no return from the kingdom of the dead for ordinary mortals and even for most gods. Before entering the underworld, Ishtar adorned herself in the most luxurious clothes and magnificent jewels, symbolizing her power and might. She appeared before the gates of the underworld, which were guarded by the stern gatekeeper Neti. He demanded that the goddess remove a piece of her attire or jewelry to pass through each of the 7 gates. Ishtar was forced to agree, and at each gate, she removed a part of her splendor. First the crown, then the earrings, necklace, belt, bracelets, clothes, and finally, the last undergarment. Completely stripped of her power and status, the goddess appeared before Ereshkigal completely naked and helpless. This had a deep symbolic meaning, emphasizing a universal law: even the most powerful gods lose their strength and authority when they descend into the realm of the dead. Upon meeting her sister, Ereshkigal was enraged, seeing her attempt to seize power. She ordered her servants to seize Ishtar and hang her on a hook in a dungeon, leaving the goddess of love and fertility in darkness and torment. While Ishtar was a prisoner of the underworld, her absence caused catastrophic consequences on Earth. People ceased to feel love, plants withered, animals stopped reproducing, and infertility and famine set in. Without Ishtar, the goddess who bestowed life and fertility, the entire world was on the brink of extinction. Seeing the impending catastrophe, the gods gathered to save Ishtar and prevent the complete destruction of life on Earth. A special role in the rescue was assigned to the wise Gaudier, who created 2 beings, endowing them with the ability to penetrate the underworld and negotiate with Ereshkigal. These messengers wisely and diplomatically managed to convince the formidable Queen of the Dead to release her sister back to Earth. But the laws of the underworld were inexorable. No one could simply leave the kingdom of the dead. Someone else had to take their place. Upon returning to the world of the living, Ishtar discovered with anger that her beloved Dumuzi had shown no grief in her absence and, moreover, had behaved carelessly and frivolously, sitting on her throne and enjoying royal luxury. Enraged by this betrayal, Ishtar ordered the demons of the underworld to seize Dumuzi and send him down in her place. Later, as the myth tells, the gods took pity and allowed Dumuzi to spend half the year on earth and half in the underworld, thereby symbolizing the changing of the seasons and the eternal cycle of death and rebirth of nature. Interestingly, it was this myth that became one of the most important sources for the concept of a dying and resurrecting deity, which would later appear in many other cultures and mythologies, such as the cult of Osiris in Egypt, Adonis among the Greeks, and Attis among the Phrygians. The Pantheon of Babylon. Shamash, the sun and justice. Another exceptionally important deity in Babylonian mythology was the god Shamash, the personification of the sun and justice. In the minds of the ancient Babylonians, he not only made his daily journey across the heavens, bringing light and warmth, but was also a great judge who observed the actions of humans and gods to render fair and impartial decisions. Shamash was usually depicted as a majestic god surrounded by the radiance of the sun's rays, holding symbols of power and justice in his hands. In Akkadian and Babylonian tradition, there is a symbolic motif of a sun chariot drawn by horses, on which the god daily crossed the celestial vault. Although this image was not as pronounced as, for example, that of the Greek Helios, it was still preserved as an important element of mythology, emphasizing the movement of the sun and its eternal struggle against the forces of darkness. The most important symbol of Shamash himself was a solar disk with 4 rays and a wavy border, which was often depicted on seals, amulets, and temple walls. The main centers for the worship of Shamash were the cities of Sippar and Larsa, where his largest and most famous temples were located. It was in these cities that the cult of the sun and justice reached its highest development. The temples of Shamash were centers of public life where many disputes were resolved. Although official court hearings were usually conducted by special elders and appointed judges, it was often the priests of Shamash who acted as important arbitrators and witnesses, confirming decisions on behalf of the god. The image of Shamash became inextricably linked with justice, and his temples were symbolically perceived as places where law and truth triumphed. Hymns and prayers dedicated to Shamash emphasized his special role as a protector of the oppressed, the poor, and the disadvantaged. People believed that he was always on the side of those who suffered from injustice and could not defend their rights on their own. That is why in times of disaster, conflict, or difficult legal proceedings, people turned to Shamash, asking for his protection and a just resolution to the situation. Shamash's special role was also emphasized in legislation. On the famous stele with the laws of Hammurabi, it is Shamash who is depicted handing the code of laws to the king, thereby symbolizing that the laws and the authority of rulers come directly from the supreme judge and the personification of truth. Another important god in the Babylonian pantheon was the god Ea, or Enki in the Sumerian tradition. He was the patron of wisdom, knowledge, and fresh waters. His image occupied a central place in Mesopotamian myths about the creation of the world and humanity, as well as in stories about how the gods interacted with mankind, revealing to them the secrets of crafts, magical rituals, and knowledge in the broadest sense. Ea, unlike most other gods, was not severe or cruel. On the contrary, he was revered as a benefactor and protector of humanity. According to the myths, Ea resided in the mythical freshwater ocean, the Apsu, the source of all earthly waters and fertility. From his underwater palace in the depths of the waters, he controlled the underground rivers and lakes that fed the fields and gardens of Mesopotamia, bestowing fertility and prosperity upon the land. The water he controlled was not only a physical source of life but also a symbol of knowledge and wisdom, allowing humanity to comprehend the mysteries of the surrounding world. Ea was famous for his unsurpassed wisdom and ingenuity. In Babylonian myths, he often acted as an advisor and diplomat among the gods, helping them resolve disputes and conflicts without bloodshed. He was often contrasted with more severe and cruel gods, such as Enlil, protecting people from their wrath and mitigating the harsh sentences they might impose on humanity. One of the most important episodes associated with Ea was the myth of the Great Flood, which later migrated into the biblical story of Noah's Ark. In various versions of this ancient myth, the hero has different names: Atrahasis in the Epic of Atrahasis, Utnapishtim in the Epic of Gilgamesh, and Noah in the biblical tradition. According to the Mesopotamian versions, when the supreme gods decided to destroy humanity with a flood for disobedience and bad behavior, it was Ea, moved by compassion, who decided to save the human race. He secretly warned a chosen man about the approaching disaster and advised him to build a ship, taking his family, animals, and plants on board. Thanks to Ea's wisdom and compassion, humanity was saved from total annihilation, which emphasized his role as a benevolent patron of people. He was also considered the patron and giver of knowledge, magic, and various crafts. He passed on to people the secrets of agriculture, construction, healing, and especially magical rituals, purification with water, and incantations against evil spirits and demons. The central place of worship was the ancient city of Eridu, where the main temple of this god was located. Ea was depicted as a bearded, wise god, surrounded by streams of fresh water and holding vessels from which flowed the rivers of knowledge and fertility. The creation myth, Enuma Elish. One of the central and most important works of Babylonian mythology was the poem Enuma Elish. The title of this work translates to "When on High," from the first words of the ancient text. The Enuma Elish explained in detail the origin of the world, the gods, and humanity itself, emphasizing the exclusive role of the supreme god Marduk. According to this epic poem, in the very beginning of the universe, there were only two primordial deities, the freshwater ocean Apsu and his consort Tiamat, the embodiment of salt waters and primal chaos. From their union, the first generations of gods were born, who soon filled the universe with noise, movement, and life. However, Apsu and Tiamat were annoyed by the restlessness and noise coming from their offspring and decided to destroy the young gods to return the universe to its original state of peace and silence. But the young god Ea, wise and powerful, uncovered Apsu's plans and, to protect the other gods, managed to neutralize the threat by putting Apsu into an eternal sleep and then killing him. Tiamat, upon learning of her husband's death, flew into a rage. She decided to avenge the young gods and began to assemble a huge army of monsters and demonic creatures, preparing for a decisive battle. At the head of this army, Tiamat placed a mighty monster named Kingu, endowing him with supreme authority and giving him the tablets of destiny, which granted the right to establish the laws of the universe. The young gods realized the mortal danger they were in, and only one of them dared to accept the challenge, the god Marduk, famous for his incredible strength, fearlessness, and wisdom. However, Marduk agreed to fight Tiamat on one condition: if after his victory, the other gods would recognize him as the supreme and most powerful of all existing gods. The gods, gripped by fear of imminent doom, unanimously agreed to his terms and proclaimed him their leader. The epic battle between Marduk and Tiamat became one of the most grandiose and dramatic events in Mesopotamian mythology. In a desperate battle, he managed to defeat Tiamat, striking her with an arrow that split her huge body into two parts. After his glorious victory, Marduk began the act of creating the world using the body of the defeated goddess. From one half of Tiamat's body, he created the heavens, and from the other, the earth, thereby establishing a new cosmic order and ending the primal chaos. Then, from the blood of Kingu, mixed with clay, Marduk created the first humans. The fact that Kingu was the leader of the army of chaos placed a symbolic guilt on humanity for rebellion against the gods. Thus, humans were created to serve the gods, to perform hard labor, and to atone for their nature and original sin through constant work, allowing the gods to rest and enjoy honor and peace. This poem was read aloud annually during the Akita festival, emphasizing the religious significance of Marduk and his central place in the city's life. Rituals and worship. Sacrifices. A crucial part of the religious beliefs of the ancient Babylonians were rituals, and in particular, sacrifices. Gods needed regular offerings to maintain peace and harmony between humans and the higher powers. The most common form of sacrifice was daily gifts to the gods, which were offered in all major temples and sanctuaries of Babylon. These gifts consisted of simple but symbolically important products: freshly baked bread, animal meat, beer, and various incenses. Bread and beer were the most common offerings, as they symbolized fertility, prosperity, and human labor. In addition to daily gifts, more serious animal sacrifices were also regularly made. The sacrificial animals were usually sheep, bulls, and various types of birds, which had to be flawless, healthy, and strong. In times of severe crisis, such as catastrophic defeats in war, prolonged droughts, or epidemics, the inhabitants of Babylon could resort to more extreme measures. In very rare and exceptional cases, human sacrifices were made. This was not a regular practice but was seen as a last resort when people believed that the wrath of the gods could not be appeased by ordinary means. The victims of such rituals were most often prisoners, convicted criminals, or slaves. The substitute king ritual. A special and unusual ritual practiced in ancient Babylon during periods of serious threats to the king's authority or the city as a whole was the substitute king ritual. It was performed when astrological signs or omens indicated the danger of death or serious illness for the real king. In such cases, priests and advisors would choose a person of low social standing, sometimes specifically one who resembled the real ruler. This substitute king was temporarily proclaimed ruler, dressed in royal robes, and adorned with royal regalia. He would move into the palace and for several days or even weeks live the life of a true king. The purpose of this ritual was to confuse and redirect the divine wrath intended for the real ruler onto him. However, such an honor was short-lived and tragic for the chosen substitute king. At the end of the ritual, death awaited him, usually through ritual strangulation, poisoning, or stabbing. This ceremonial execution took place in strict secrecy. Thus, it was believed that the wrath of the gods had fallen on the substitute king, and the real ruler, purified and saved, could continue his reign in safety and prosperity. The splendor of Babylon's architecture. The era of Nebuchadnezzar II's reign was a true golden age for Babylon. The state not only reached the pinnacle of its power and influence but also experienced an incredible cultural and scientific flourishing. Babylon became the recognized center of civilization, where sciences, art, and especially architecture developed rapidly, capturing the imagination of contemporaries. It was during this period that grandiose construction projects were undertaken, transforming the city into a magnificent capital. First and foremost, the king ordered the city walls to be significantly strengthened and expanded, making Babylon practically impregnable. According to ancient authors like Herodotus, the walls were truly colossal, about 25 meters high and so wide that several chariots could ride abreast on them. However, modern archaeologists consider these figures somewhat exaggerated. Nevertheless, the walls were indeed powerful and impressive, with numerous towers and bastions, as well as deep defensive moats filled with water from the Euphrates. An especially famous architectural masterpiece of this era was the majestic Ishtar Gate. This was the main ceremonial structure at the northern entrance to the city, through which the most important festival processions and ceremonies passed. The gate was named in honor of the goddess Ishtar and was decorated with stunningly bright glazed brickwork. Against a deep blue background, symbolizing the celestial vault, were images of mythical creatures and sacred animals, dragons, bulls, and lions, laid out in colored ceramic tiles. The impressive road leading from the Ishtar Gate into the city was called the Processional Way and was also lined with glazed bricks with symbolic images, creating a grandiose impression on arriving guests. However, the most legendary and mysterious structure in Babylon was the Grand Ziggurat at Etemenanke, which went down in history as the Tower of Babel. This majestic step temple, dedicated to the supreme god Marduk, was considered a symbol of cosmic order and the power of the Babylonian kingdom. The name Etemenanke translated as House of the Foundation of Heaven and Earth, emphasizing its connection to the cosmos and the Babylonians' ideas about the creation of the world. The ziggurat consisted of 7 step tiers, each smaller in area than the one below. On the very top platform was the sanctuary of the god Marduk, to which only the high priests and the king had access. According to ancient sources, the total height of the tower may have exceeded 90 meters, which was an exceptional engineering achievement for the ancient world. Contrary to popular belief, archaeological research does not confirm that all the bricks of the ziggurat were covered with glaze. Most likely, glazed bricks were used partially and selectively to decorate the most important and prominent elements of the structure. Besides its religious purpose, Etemenanke also performed important astronomical functions. From the upper terraces of the ziggurat, priests regularly observed the starry sky, recording the movement of celestial bodies and creating calendars that were then used to accurately determine the timing of religious festivals and agricultural cycles. Although it is not entirely correct to call Etemenanke a full-fledged observatory, its upper tiers did indeed allow for systematic and accurate astronomical observations. The Hanging Gardens of Semiramis. One of the most mysterious and romantic structures of ancient Babylon was the legendary Hanging Gardens, known to history as the Gardens of Semiramis. This magnificent creation was so grand and unique that it was later included in the list of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. And although modern historians and archaeologists still debate whether these gardens actually existed or were merely a beautiful legend, stories about them continue to capture the imagination and inspire people around the world. According to one of the most popular versions, the Hanging Gardens were built during the reign of Nebuchadnezzar II as a gift for his beloved wife, Queen Amytis. However, the name Amytis is known only from much later sources, and no direct Babylonian documents confirming her existence have been found. Nevertheless, a beautiful legend tells that the queen came from the mountainous country of Media, which had abundant greenery, streams, and cool mountain gardens. Babylon, surrounded by hot sands and an endless plain, seemed dreary and suffocating to her, and she began to miss her homeland. Wishing to console his beloved wife and give her at least a small piece of the familiar landscape, Nebuchadnezzar ordered the construction of amazing gardens for her that would remind her of mountain slopes covered with lush greenery and flowers. According to ancient descriptions, the Hanging Gardens were a huge multi-tiered structure, resembling a stepped pyramid or a cascade of green terraces. Each level of these gardens was carefully fortified and waterproofed with layers of bitumen and lead so that the soil would not seep down. Then, fertile soil was laid on them, in which various trees, flowers, shrubs, and exotic plants brought from different corners of the ancient world were planted. The gardens were designed in such a way that from below, it seemed as if the plants were literally hanging in the air. This is where the name Hanging Gardens came from. One of the most impressive achievements of the ancient builders was a complex irrigation system that kept the gardens always green and blooming in the hot climate of Mesopotamia. According to ancient sources, water was supplied to the upper tiers using lifting mechanisms. Most likely, these were systems of chain pumps or water-lifting wheels, driven by the power of animals or the labor of numerous workers. The water then cascaded down, irrigating the plants and creating a coolness in the air, similar to the mountain streams the queen missed so much. Descriptions of the Hanging Gardens are found in the works of several ancient authors, including Diodorus Siculus and Strabo, who wrote about the gardens as an extraordinary spectacle that amazed even the most seasoned travelers. The Greeks referred to the magnificent gardens with the word paradisos, from which the modern word paradise later derived. Ancient authors described tall trees and lush crowns, numerous flower alleys, fragrant flower beds, and shady corners that created the impression of a paradise garden in the middle of the desert. However, despite the numerous descriptions by ancient authors, archaeologists have not yet found convincing archaeological evidence for the existence of such gardens in Babylon. This has given rise to a number of hypotheses and disputes among historians. One of the most compelling modern hypotheses, proposed by Stephanie Daly of Oxford, suggests that the famous Hanging Gardens may have actually been located in Nineveh, the capital of Assyria, and built during the reign of the Assyrian king Sennacherib. Later, during the Hellenistic period, the Greeks may have confused the Assyrian gardens with the Babylonian ones, transferring them in their imagination to the more famous city of Babylon. Also, the name Semiramis, with which the Hanging Gardens are associated, is historically unrelated to the time of Nebuchadnezzar II. In ancient texts, Semiramis is the name of the legendary Assyrian queen Shamash, who lived long before the era of Nebuchadnezzar. Thus, this name most likely became attached to the gardens only thanks to romantic and fabulous descriptions made much later. Even if the Hanging Gardens did exist, they were probably not a separate, standalone structure, but part of the vast palace complex created by Nebuchadnezzar. Babylonian science and knowledge. Not only the architecture but also the science of Babylon was exceptionally advanced and played a crucial role in the development of the entire ancient civilization in Mesopotamia. The Babylonians achieved particular success in fields such as astronomy, mathematics, writing, and the systematization of knowledge, which made their legacy unique and invaluable for subsequent cultures. Astronomy held a central place in the intellectual life of Babylon. Babylonian priests were among the most skilled and accurate observers of celestial phenomena. From the heights of temple complexes and upper terraces, they regularly and carefully watched the movement of the stars, the moon, and the planets, recording their observations on clay tablets. However, they not only observed but also actively developed mathematical models to predict celestial events. For example, the Babylonians successfully predicted solar and lunar eclipses, discovering the famous Sarah cycle, a period of 18 years and 11 days, after which eclipses repeat with astonishing accuracy. It was in Babylon that astrological predictions based on observed celestial phenomena were first systematized, combining astronomy and religion into a single discipline, astrology. The zodiac in its complete form took shape in late Babylon, around the 5th century BC, thanks to Chaldean astronomers, although individual constellations and their observations existed and were recorded much earlier. No less impressive were the achievements of the ancient Babylonians in mathematics. Babylonian mathematics was closely linked to their practical needs, trade, construction, and astronomy, but it was also surprisingly developed and could be considered theoretical for its time. The Babylonians used an unusual sexagesimal, base 60, number system. It is this system that gave us the division of an hour into 60 minutes and a minute into 60 seconds, which is still used today. Babylonian mathematicians could solve complex problems, calculate the areas and volumes of various figures, determine proportions and percentages, and also solve problems resembling early algebraic equations. Their mathematical methods were recorded on numerous clay tablets that have survived to our time and still amaze with their accuracy and depth. Libraries and archives of clay tablets played a huge role in the preservation and transmission of scientific and cultural knowledge. These archives were giant repositories of knowledge where documents from a wide variety of fields, from religious texts and laws to scientific tables and literary works, were systematically collected and stored. Although the most famous is the library of the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal, discovered in Nineveh, similar collections existed in Babylon, containing thousands of tablets with mathematical calculations, astronomical tables, and business documents. The clay tablets on which all this knowledge was recorded proved to be true eternal books. Unlike papyrus and parchment, clay did not deteriorate over time, surviving for millennia. It is thanks to such tablets that we can now study the achievements and features of Babylonian civilization in detail. The legacy of Babylon had a huge influence on subsequent cultures. Through the ancient Greeks, particularly through the famous scholar Ptolemy, Babylonian achievements in astronomy and mathematics entered European science, laying the foundation for its further development. The Babylonian captivity. And now let us return to history, where dramatic and pivotal events await us. In 586 BC, an event occurred in the heart of the ancient Near East that forever changed the fate of an entire people. This was the famous Babylonian captivity of the Jews, a tragic episode that profoundly influenced the entire subsequent history and religious beliefs of the Jewish people. As we mentioned earlier, after the first capture of Jerusalem by the Babylonians in 597 BC, Nebuchadnezzar placed his appointee, King Zedekiah, on the Judean throne, from whom he expected complete loyalty and submission. However, King Zedekiah, failing to meet expectations, soon attempted to rise against Babylon again, hoping for support from Egypt. This disobedience led to even harsher consequences. In 587 BC, Babylonian troops besieged Jerusalem, and the siege lasted for more than a year. Finally, in 586 BC, the city fell after heavy fighting. Nebuchadnezzar decided to punish the rebels cruelly, suppressing the resistance once and for all. The city of Jerusalem was almost completely destroyed. Its walls were razed to the ground. The magnificent Temple of Solomon, the center of Jewish religious life, was burned and demolished. Many of the city's inhabitants were killed or died during the siege from famine and disease. But the most tragic consequence was that a significant portion of the remaining population was forcibly relocated to Babylon. Thus began the famous Babylonian captivity, which lasted for about half a century. The Jews found themselves in a foreign land, among foreign gods and traditions. It is important to emphasize that the Jews in Babylon were not slaves in the strict sense of the word. It was more of a forced resettlement, where many could freely engage in crafts, trade, and even achieve a certain degree of success. Nevertheless, the longing for their homeland and the destroyed temple never left their hearts, as reflected in the famous Psalm 137, "By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down, yea, we wept," which became a symbol of their sorrow and hope for return. It was during the Babylonian exile that the final realization of the universality of God Yahweh occurred. Without the temple and the ability to perform traditional sacrifices, the Jews re-evaluated their faith and understood that Yahweh was not just the God of the specific land of Israel, but the one and universal God of the entire world. This became a crucial milestone in the formation of Judaism as it is known today. During this period, the tradition of synagogues, community gatherings and prayer houses began to take its final shape, allowing them to maintain their religious and national identity far from their homeland. Also during the captivity, many religious texts that would later become part of the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, began to be actively collected and systematized. The Babylonian captivity became a key event that transformed Judaism from a religion exclusively tied to temple rituals into a religion of the book, based on text and spiritual tradition. The fall of an empire. In 539 BC, the final chapter in the great history of ancient Babylon began. In that year, the troops of the Persian king Cyrus II, known as Cyrus the Great, approached the walls of the famous city. Babylon, for decades considered an impregnable fortress and a symbol of absolute power, suddenly found itself on the brink of its final fall. Cyrus the Great was an outstanding military commander and a wise ruler who united vast territories under his rule and created the largest empire of his time, the Achaemenid Empire. He possessed not only strength and strategic thinking but also the ability to understand and use the political and religious sentiments of the peoples he wished to conquer. This is precisely what helped him conquer Babylon almost without bloodshed. Ancient historians Herodotus and Xenophon tell of a daring military trick by which Cyrus supposedly captured the city by diverting the waters of the Euphrates into pre-prepared channels and entering through the shallowed riverbed inside the city walls. This colorful story was popular for a long time, but modern historians question its reality. Most likely, the city was not taken by storm but capitulated without serious resistance or was handed over to Cyrus as a result of negotiations with the Babylonian nobility and priesthood. Evidence of Cyrus's peaceful and diplomatic approach is the famous Cyrus Cylinder. This is a crucial archaeological artifact on which Cyrus himself describes his conquest of Babylon. In this document, the Persian king presents himself as a liberator who restored order, honored the local gods, and protected the rights of the city's inhabitants. This cylinder is often called the first declaration of human rights, emphasizing its significance in the history of humanitarian ideas. Cyrus paid special attention to the Jews who were in captivity in Babylon. He allowed them to return to their homeland and rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. This decision is reflected not only in the Bible but also in the Cyrus Cylinder itself. Thus, his policy was not only wise from a diplomatic point of view but also very tolerant in religious and cultural terms, which made Cyrus one of the most respected rulers of his time. The conquest of Babylon by Cyrus did not mark the end of its glory and greatness. In the first years after the conquest, the city retained a special status and significant influence. Babylon was effectively the second capital of the Persian Empire, and Persian kings regularly visited it and took part in famous religious festivals, such as the New Year festival of Akitu. However, despite this respect, Babylon forever lost its political independence, becoming part of the Persian Empire. Over time, Babylon became one of the most important provinces of the empire, and it was from this period that its gradual decline began. Rebellions against Persian rule repeatedly broke out in the city, especially under kings like Darius I and Xerxes, which further accelerated the decline of its political importance and influence. The most important decisions were no longer made in Babylon but in Persepolis, Susa, and Ecbatana, where the administrative and economic centers of power gradually shifted. The final echoes of greatness. After Babylon became part of the Persian Empire, it continued to gradually lose its former greatness and importance. However, the ancient city's history once again flared brightly in the 4th century BCE when, in 331 BC, the greatest conqueror of his time, Alexander the Great, arrived. Alexander was fascinated by the legendary history and grandeur of Babylon and chose it as one of his main eastern residences. The Macedonians saw in the city not only an important strategic point but also a symbolic place that could confirm his status as the successor to the ancient great kings of Mesopotamia. Alexander truly wanted to make Babylon the capital of his New World Empire, uniting the cultures of the East and the West. The Greek king planned grandiose restoration works, primarily of the famous ziggurat of Etemenanke, dedicated to the god Marduk. However, despite his ambitious plans, Alexander did not manage to realize almost any of them. In 323 BC, in the prime of his life, he unexpectedly died in Babylon. With him, the ambitious dreams of the city's revival also collapsed. After Alexander's death, his vast empire was divided among his generals, or diadochi. They, especially the rulers of the Seleucid dynasty, quickly moved the center of power to the new city of Seleucia on the Tigris, specially founded for this purpose. Subsequently, Ctesiphon became the main center of the region. The relocation of the most important trade routes and administrative centers to these new cities was a fatal blow to Babylon, depriving it of its former economic significance and influence. Gradually, its final decline began. Inhabitants left the city en masse in search of better living conditions, and the once majestic buildings and structures gradually fell into ruin from time and lack of maintenance. By the 1st century BC, Babylon was already a sad and gloomy ruin, although small settlements still existed among the remnants of its former greatness. Historians date the complete decline and final resettlement of the last inhabitants of the city to the 1st century CE. Roman travelers and historians, such as Strabo and Pliny the Elder, who visited Babylon in the 1st centuries of our era, described it as sad ruins that evoked more sorrow than admiration in travelers. The great city of legends had turned into a silent reminder of the transience of human greatness. Since then, ancient Babylon has remained a symbol of greatness and fall, splendor and destruction, the strength and weakness of human civilization. Its legends and achievements continue to inspire and amaze us even today, reminding us of how easily powerful empires and great cities can disappear, leaving behind only memories and lessons of history.